All right, we got a lot to cover today, so let's get this started. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Ryan Jones. I lead our project strategy team here at Right Side Up. For those of you who aren't familiar with Right Side Up, we're a collective of growth marketing specialists who have helped more than 400 VC-backed tech companies, as well as many companies outside of tech, hit their growth goals. We cover virtually all paid channels: SEO, CRO, email marketing, product marketing, yes, analytics, a big focus of the topic today, and much more. But enough about us. Today's discussion is all about attribution, every growth marketing geek's favorite topic, or maybe I shouldn't project and I should just speak for myself here. Certainly the case for me. We'll dig into different attribution models, how your strategy should evolve as your company grows, the importance of incrementality testing, how marketers are approaching attribution post iOS 14.5, and much more. We'll be doing all this with the help of today's panelists, Rian Long and Chelsea Cramer, both of whom I'm really excited to introduce you all to. To start with, Rian, he began his career in analytics and has gone on to hold marketing leadership positions at then early stage businesses like FanDuel, WAG, and GoodRx, which many of you are probably familiar with, which tells you they're not necessarily so early stage anymore. He's currently bringing his data-driven approach and experience navigating attribution in a wide variety of business models, business stages, a big focus of today's topic, how we sort of think about analytics and attribution at different stages of maturity of an organization and marketing program and industries, to Right Side Up client as a fractional marketing leader. He's also adept at shaping attribution to varying media mixes, including digital, broadcast, and offline media. Chelsea Cramer, she tells me she fell in love with Google Analytics early in her career, which has spanned ad agencies, early and late stage startups, in-house, and tech companies analyzing offline, digital, and social channels. She's currently full-time in-house at Credit Karma, where she spends most of her days solving attribution problems and helping marketers better understand the user journey. They both got a lot of great material and insight to share with us today, and I'm excited to help guide this discussion. Before we begin, a couple quick housekeeping items. One, any questions you have, which we'll save some time to address at the end, please submit using the Zoom Q&A functionality. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen, using the Zoom Q&A functionality instead of the chat feature. And we are recording this discussion, so we'll share the recording with everyone as well as the slides with you via email next week. So you'll have that as a follow-up to look forward to. Now for the fun part. To jump in, for me, as I think about attribution in my own career leading up to this point, which is comprised of about 10 years of in-house experience at different tech companies, mostly in the Bay Area, it's helpful for me to sort of conceptualize what a theoretically perfect attribution model looks like, which we all know doesn't exist, and then start to sort of break it down or tear it apart by layering in all the practical constraints that we're up against, both generally in terms of what's possible and specifically with regards to the organization I'm in and supporting, the stage of maturity, the volume of data that we have, the budgets and resources we can allocate, et cetera. So to kick off the discussion, Chelsea and Ryan, I'd love to first hear from each of you in your own words. What is the concept of attribution, and how would you sort of frame what a perfect theoretical attribution model looks like? And then from there, we'll continue to sort of break that down, as I noted, with some of the practical constraints.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, I would say for me, it's really easy to get caught up in all the tech jargon and noise of attribution and all the data signals. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do with attribution is just understand what's adding value to a business and what isn't. And it's really easy to kind of lose sight of that in all the noise of signals and things like that. But that's in a perfect world what it is. And in a perfect world, we would have that understanding of maybe even things consumers don't know about themselves, like that conversation they had with a friend or the commercial that kind of impacted them, but it wasn't until they saw it 3 times that they acted, and just all of those various things. I think speaking of the practical constraints, the real world, there's a lot of potential for bias just in terms of where things exist in a funnel, with lower funnel having a lot more potential to claim credit. When you get into kind of offline channels, the way you measure different tactics varies a lot, and it's really can get pretty quickly away from that dream scenario. But I think as long as you're focusing on value, that's where we'd want to be in that dream scenario.
Great. Chelsea, how about you? What's your perspective?
Yeah, agree with Ryan about the dream scenario where we know the exact importance of every single touch point on a consumer's journey. I think My favorite way I've heard attribution referred to is it's a best guess at how well our marketing is working and what's exactly working. We have to make assumptions based on kind of the data that we have, and we do have limited data when it comes to attribution. So, in a perfect world, we do have every single touch point, whether consumers even aware of it or not. But in our imperfect world, we have the data that we have, which for the most part is click-based attribution in terms of what's truly concrete about a user. And even that's slowly going away. So we just have to, work with what we have to kind of make some assumptions and take our best guess at what's really working.
Great. Any thoughts on like causal versus sort of correlation with some of these attribution data points? Like I think the best example or the easiest example that comes to mind for me is search, right? Like there is very often a correlation with a search touch point and a subsequent conversion goal. It doesn't necessarily mean it's causal. Like, what is your perspective on like how to think about that and where marketers can often get tripped up and sort of misattributing conversions with sort of correlated but not causal touch points?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'm sure we're going to get into kind of this more as we go along with some of the different subjects. But I would say that one thing I've seen a lot is that companies I've worked with, especially those that are maybe just kind of getting started in this area, will really be focused a lot more on the bottom, bottom of funnel kind of last click things that they can measure, and especially in more considered purchase funnels where it might take a period of time and the signals are more likely to get degraded. And really, there's another touch that's difficult to measure that created that awareness and needs to be amplified in terms of value. So I do think things like media mix models can help tease that out. We're going to get into that more, but you're dead on. Usually where I end up directing companies to go is looking at figuring out that top of funnel a lot more, because a lot of channels can pretty easily close that last click, but it's really hard to create that initial interest in a cost-effective way.
Yeah. I think that's a good sort of segue into the practical side of this. I, again, like the framing of the theoretical side. It's the least actionable part of what we'll talk about here for obvious reasons, but now sort of thinking through some of the like, both the constraints and then some of the like unique considerations, Rian, as you sort of touched on with some products or services that may be more of a considered purchase, like excited to get into that a little bit more and talk about the reality of how all this plays out in various companies. So with that, let's think through the constraints. Like for me, as I think about it, and you guys will have many more that come to mind, Ryan and Chelsea, but some of the obvious ones are how much budget do I have to invest both in technology and human resources to manage my sort of attribution logic and program around my marketing efforts. That is a real constraint in terms of how sort of sophisticated an organization can be in their approach to it. Similarly, I also think of volume of data, right? If you don't have sufficient data to garner statistical significance, or at least sort of directional significance in sort of the logic of what is driving what in terms of conversions, that is a natural constraint that many companies will be up against as well. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the two extremes of being a very early stage company and a very late stage company, and how you might sort of think about what tools and strategies are appropriate to consider with regards to attribution. Starting with early stage, so let's say you're a company running paid media budgets under 50K a month across a couple of digital channels, maybe a handful of other touch points through a little bit of organic SEO, let's say PR, but just sort of making generalizations, what would you sort of describe as like an optimal way to think about or approach attribution, the tech stack, resourcing behind it, and so on?
Yeah, I think early stage, like the easiest thing to do is you'd be using Google Analytics, just especially if you're using multiple channels. I think if you're just on one channel, that's the only case where I would advocate for looking at like the in-platform measurement. I think having worked with this a while, we do see all the platforms want to make themselves look better. So you will see those conversions be much bigger than you might see using a Google Analytics, but at least then you can see like the relative performance of your campaigns within that platform and be able to optimize that way. And especially, early on where you're trying to be as efficient as possible, where every dollar really counts. Like that's an okay strategy to take. I think as you start running on multiple channels, that's when you want to start setting up Google Analytics and getting more complex with how you're looking at it, because with GA you do have the ability to look at first click or last click. In terms of your attribution, maybe your funnel's getting a little bit more complicated, and things like word of mouth, you can start to really track your organic conversions over time. But there still is that human cost in getting all of that set up. So you just want to make sure that you have the bandwidth of people internally who can set those things up and set them up correctly.
Yeah, I think your framing earlier of attribution being a best guess is a good one, right? Like depending on the sophistication of the attribution program you can and should have, it's no matter what imperfect, but certainly like at earlier stages, if you're limited to click-based attribution, for example, it is a best guess exercise, and that's okay. Like I've been in so many roles myself historically, always sort of wondering, why is my company's attribution program and model not as sophisticated as others out there? Truth is that I was probably wrong. Like it was as sophisticated, it just was not sort of like the holy grail of what attribution could be. But even more so, it is sort of that exercise of like right sizing the program based on where you are, and a best guess is okay and better than nothing. And based on the resources required to invest in a more sophisticated program, often better than sort of making that investment based on the return you're going to get incrementally of sort of a more sophisticated program. Rian, any thoughts from your perspective on like the early stage version of attribution, how you think about that from a tooling and strategy perspective?
Yeah, I think I generally echo Chelsea for sure. I think a few practical things. If you're just starting out, you might want to just start out with GA4 as opposed to a universal analytics account, given that that's going to become the standard next year. If you're running kind of UA now, I would probably recommend paralleling GA4 so that you have year-over-year data sooner instead of waiting till the deadline. But I agree that that, and GA4 brings in some potential to do something other than last touch modeling in a fairly a free tool, which is nice, whereas UA is last touch. So a few little practical considerations there. The other big thing I would say is just take advantage of everything that's freely available through things like Tag Manager. You can set up some pretty convenient ways of keeping tracking smooth across all your platforms as you grow, and make that your hub in a free way. It's just time. And then I'd say the other thing really is taking advantage of the platform side pieces as well, which I completely agree with what Chelsea said. We don't want to be looking at platform as your attribution, but it is still very important for comparing within itself so that you can know what to prioritize. Did test A or test B win within, say, Meta or Google? But then I'm not going to let Meta tell me how many total dollars I should be spending on Meta, but I should let it help me figure out what's the best way to spend that. Mm-hmm. And I see a lot of businesses not taking advantage of the free tools, like really, since a lot of the privacy laws have changed. What I mean by that is like server side tracking. And so that has in the last 6 months or so rolled out to a much longer tail of platforms that didn't used to have that, some of the smaller players. And I would definitely recommend taking advantage of that as well, just to have that comparison points between what you're doing in this case in GA, and then what you're also seeing on the platform side.
And just for clarity, when you guys refer to platform, you're referring to ad platform.
Ad platform, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. If you're a growth marketer managing a growth marketing team function, how do you know where you should fall on this sort of sophistication spectrum between the sort of Google Analytics suite as the solution or sort of like sole solution to the other end of the spectrum of a very sophisticated sort of like multi-tool media mix modeling solution? And we can talk a little bit more about that scenario in a minute.
I mean, I personally tend to think of this as kind of orders of magnitude of a business. The things that you did to get you from 0 to 1 million are not necessarily the things that work from 1 to 10 and from 10 to 100 and on up. And I think I think your attribution tools fall into that spectrum. And so we were talking, maybe in the 10 million kind of range, I think, or so in the first example. But if you're kind of going to grow that $100 million business, I would start to look at, really bringing more of that into my own data platforms where I can really kind of ingest all these signals and manipulate it in ways that make sense to my business. And I think that's kind of part of that leveling up, like you would do with the rest of the org. Certainly you would do the same with staffing and other things. So I look at analytics as the same way, and attribution, and would be also expecting that channels would be growing in that business. That's kind of making that step function change. That's probably going to be going eventually into away from the simple, purely digital model of only digital channels and into maybe things like TV or, where there's digital signals on linear or on OTT, but not so much on linear. You've got offline channels, maybe you're doing direct mail, you got to start ingesting files, and there's just a lot more consideration. So I think you're starting to look at customized tools at that point that you can, build to be your own.
Yeah. Chelsea, to position the question a little bit differently to get your take, have you been in scenarios in your roles where you're making a business case with sort of the financials behind it to say, we should make this investment in more sophisticated attribution technology, and here's the case as to why, based on the sort of expected return in terms of our ability to better allocate marketing dollars?
Yeah, I've definitely recently done that with offline attribution tools. So, looking at your TV and your OTT spend, trying to figure out with which of these platforms were actually going to be the most accurate, which was a very fuzzy problem to solve. Ultimately, offline is kind of a mess in terms of attribution. So it's a lot of triangulation, I would say, like running your own incrementality tests. But ultimately, if you think that, one of these tools that costs $200,000 a year is going to save the time of one of your employees doing it or a potential hire, that could be super valuable. And I also think, with switching over to any tool, there's generally a pretty high cost, both financial and in terms of, the people cost behind it, and whether you have to hire someone to set up that tool, whether it's, a data engineer who's got to kind of stand up that tool that might not be able to work on anything else. So they're all kind of important considerations to keep in mind to make sure that you're actually able to get a tool over the finish line. Because I think it's easy to get pretty distracted by a lot of these new shiny tools. I mean, I'm sure anybody on this call is getting, sales emails every single day from people who say they have the best attribution tool. They can, they've helped, whatever company, whatever buzzy company improve their LTVs by 50% by decreasing CPAs and focusing on the right customers, which all sound fine and dandy in theory. But unless you can actually implement what they're selling, it's hard to get those results.
Yes.
I think there's a danger on the flip side too, which is, I'll leave names out of it, but I've seen companies that have been spending millions a year on programs that, once tested for incrementality turned out to have none. And so, I think with the growth, my whole kind of point with the growth is with the growth, the bar for which the tool, if the tool makes you 1% better and you're a huge company, that's maybe that's enough, right? And so I think it just wouldn't make sense if you're the tiny company to spend money on the huge tool. And the kind of my whole point is there's this evolution that you really need to follow in terms of stepping up as your business steps up, and making sure you're not that company that's, spending a lot on the thing you haven't tested, but also not building it too far in advance and kind of putting risk in terms of capital into your business that maybe isn't time to invest yet.
Yeah. Any recommendations on how to approach internal education on attribution and sort of representing the marketing function's needs, and maybe in particular with a finance team, anything that you guys have experienced that has either been very successful from sort of a positioning, frankly, maybe relationship management perspective, that has enabled you to sort of move those efforts forward in a way that is very positive for the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the stakeholders and like what their questions normally are. What I've found recently is presenting why you're skeptical about what you're presenting first, explaining all of the potential downsides to kind of like the way you're looking at what you're looking at, so that there's at least a level of trust there that you know the downsides to begin with, rather than you're presenting it as this is absolutely what it is. Because I think, especially with like financial stakeholders, they really like to be skeptical. I think that's for whatever reason that type of person really leans into finance. And generally with marketing, there's a little bit of distrust there to begin with. I don't know where that comes from, but that's always what I've experienced. So it's important to just, explain that skepticism and just make sure you're all on the same page, that like you want this budget to be as efficient as possible, both together. And like, we think the tool can help in this way, but there's still downsides.
Yeah, I think it's just important to know your audience as well. I think the conversation we're just having about, hey, what's the ROI of this? I feel like that's the view the finance team generally cares about. It. Obviously, you can't, say that perfectly before you sign up. You don't know what wins you're going to uncover, but which is kind of why I also like to position it in terms of here's what is needed for the break even. So I kind of like, here's what we could do, but here's the break even. Look, the bar's really low. We're in a good place. That may be a very different conversation if you're on a team and pitching this to your CMO, who has, a lot more knowledge about marketing, or if you are the CMO and you're pitching it to, other people on the C-suite, that also might need to be kind of tailored to their particular lens, which tends to be more kind of bottom line and less of the, ins and outs that we as marketers are probably talking about.
Yeah, I can share one brief story from a company I was at where our business was 40% of our business revenue was driven by what was attributed to direct mail. But what we didn't know is how much of the business was driven that wasn't attributed. And there was a point in time where the business was facing a challenging environment, and the directive from the CEO down was to cut direct mail spend because the marginal return on sort of the incremental tiers into which we were sending direct mail looked unprofitable. The argument from the marketing team was, hold on, clearly there's just a lot of sort of indirect attribution that we're not accounting for here. And it was a very difficult business case to make to continue to retain that investment in direct mail without being able to sort of demonstrate that in the data. So I think it just sort of, and this is a program that was spending tens of millions a month on marketing. I think it just sort of speaks to like how critical this education piece is for the success of the business in many cases.
And I know we're going to get into this, Ryan, and so I won't say too much here, but I think this is where some of the other tools that you can layer on top, like surveys and other things like that, help. I'd say most businesses I've been in have about 50% that's just unattributed. It looks like it's direct or some other thing, and it does vary, but those people didn't just wake up and decide to show up at your website or your app, right? Something happened. We really, when we say direct, I've heard some people in orgs call that free, and I really push back on that because it's not free. What we're saying when we say direct is we have no idea. And so I think the whole idea of some of the things we're going to get into is to demystify that we have no idea, and to start to have some idea, and to change that lens of, no, it's not free. It's just we did something. It just happened in a way that doesn't produce a click.
Yep. Maybe let's transition and talk a little bit about attribution models. My sense is that this audience is generally pretty familiar with sort of the range of attribution models, but I still think it's helpful to speak to it and sort of frame it a little bit. And maybe to sort of provide some perspective, like most of my own experience is I'd sort of categorize or sort of classify as like early to mid stage, beyond the like pure or sole sort of Google Analytics solution, but not to the level of sophistication of media mix modeling, sort of somewhere in between. I've always sort of thought about like the core attribution model as sort of, one sort of thing in isolation, and then layering in sort of discrete incrementality tests on top of that. But in speaking with you guys, Ryan and Chelsea, and not surprisingly based on my own sort of understanding, really like as you sort of move along that spectrum of sophistication, your entire model sort of becomes one big incrementality test where you're sort of consistently iterating on that over time. So maybe Chelsea, if you don't mind starting, can you just sort of walk us through generally like some of the more commonly used attribution models, and then how you sort of think about the evolution of those with regards to like incrementality testing as you sort of move along that sophistication spectrum? And quickly too, if you can just sort of define in your words like what incrementality or lift testing is, that might be helpful too.
Yeah, so I feel like the general attribution models that are used, like there's first touch or last touch. So first touch being all the credit goes to the first channel that someone interacted with within the attribution window. Last touch would be most of the credit goes to the last touch that someone had before converting. And I feel like generally speaking, most things that you're looking at are just they default to last touch. There's also, linear, which would be, if someone has 4 touches during their conversion journey, the credit would be distributed basically 25% to each of those touches. There's U-shaped, where, you'll see credit split between the first and the last touch. You might get some for the middle few touches as well, depending on how you look at it. And then lastly, like there would be a time series view, which attributes most of the credit to the last touch, but then kind of like steps down over time. So you still have a little bit of credit on your first touch, but it increases as you get closer to the conversion event. So that's kind of like the way it works on a click-based perspective. I think with incrementality, like what you're generally looking at is on an individual channel level. So if we turn off spend for some users on one channel and we keep running spend for another group of users on that channel, basically what is the actual impact within all of those users outside of those clicks? So starting to think about, is this channel more effective or less effective than our clicks are telling us? And from there, what I've seen some companies do is actually apply some sort of a multiplier to any conversions coming in from that channel, just to assume we think it's more or less effective than the clicks tell us. So you can do that on an individual channel level. Obviously, you could add in like cross-channel layers with that to start thinking about how all your channels work together. But then even further down beyond that would be your media mix model, where that's more of a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach, where you're looking at all these clicks. With a media mix model, you're looking at all your spend, all your impressions, and then all your conversions, and basically modeling how all of that works together per channel, so that you start to understand what the kind of relative impact of spending $1 on your offline channels are relative to your branded search channels. So then that provides you more of a like another layer of incrementality in terms of performance there. And that's a long-term solution, right? No one's running media mix models every day. You need a substantial amount of historical data to run those, and that's generally something you're not rerunning constantly. So you might get updated results like once a month from something like that, but it can start to help kind of paint the picture of how well your marketing is doing if you look at it like really holistically.
Is that something you're typically doing solely in-house with a third-party like service provider, third-party technology? How do you approach that?
I've seen it done both ways. So working with third parties where you're basically sending them all the data, they have the expertise to really dig through it. I've also seen it working internally where you'd have an entire data science team working with it. Obviously pros and cons to both. I think the pros of working internally are, there's not a ton of back and forth in terms of this is how our product works. Here's what we expect it to look like. Those things, internal folks might just know, and you can have a lot more flexibility with a model or having something just kind of like run automatically through kind of whatever internal tools you have versus, working with a vendor. You might get that update, but they ultimately likely own the code that's kind of creating the model. So you'll basically always have to have that contract if you want to get, updated views from them.
Mm-hmm. Not to put you guys on the spot, any like scenarios come to mind where you would often see sort of like a 1 + 1 = 3 equation of multiple touch points, where sort of sequentially like the outcome is more than either touch point isolation? The combination of multiple touch points is likely to sort of drive users towards your end objective. And therefore, like media mix modeling is that much more effective at sort of understanding that causal relationship.
Yeah, I've seen it actually work with like an individual test, but with YouTube and email working extremely well together. I don't know if anyone's read the stats on YouTube, but it's like quickly becoming kind of like the most watched social media platform of anything. So I guess it ultimately does make sense. People are really engaged with it compared to other channels. But yeah, that was something interesting that popped up in a recent test that was done.
I found similar examples as well, with, having direct mail and then doing like retargeting versus not, and kind of coordinating those two things. I think the media mix modeling can get to some of the, core drivers and correlations and causation that is, it can be helpful and powerful, but, to Chelsea's point, it's not for everybody, every company. It takes a lot of scale and a lot of discipline and a lot of people, and it's really kind of an end state. I think when we talk about some of the different just kind of curves of attribution that we talked about with that Chelsea mentioned with U-shaped and other things, I would say that if we had that example of just the beginnings of your company and you're taking advantage of the free tools and you're doing last touch through Google Analytics, from there, really some of those defined views are really a chance for you to say, well, we know this isn't perfect, but we can put some of our lens of our business into this and make something that we think is just a little more tailored and is pretty quick and easy and doesn't have all the ramifications of resources that the media mix model has, but still gets you to a better place. And usually what I have found is it needs to move towards the top of the funnel away from the bottom of the funnel, because the bottom of the funnel is really easy for stuff to take credit, and you might not actually be creating new value. The other thing is, it just depends on your purchase cycle. If you're a business that has, more of an impulse buy and people tend to buy within 24 to 48 hours or install your app or something like that, I think that's a pretty different lens than if you're a really big expensive purchase that people might think about for weeks or months. And I think in the latter example, it's more likely that you want to be skewing even more towards first touch, is what I typically see. I think when you do last touch, and companies especially like that have considered cycles, what they end up with is a bunch of first touch, a bunch of tactics that are generating new interest that look like they have a really high CAC, a bunch of bottom of funnel tactics that look like they're incredibly inexpensive. Then about half of your transactions, you're just not sure and they look free. And so you end up with this, your true CAC's in the middle, but you have this bifurcation of what your channels look like, and you're kind of left, not being sure what to do. And that's where I think some of these other models can help.
Yeah. Can we dive in a little bit deeper to offline attribution? And I suggest that because I think it sort of like brings to the surface many tactics that actually can apply nicely to digital channels as well, where maybe like cookie tracking or user-based tracking doesn't paint the complete picture. Can you guys speak a little bit to some like common tools or tactics you've worked with that have been effective in tracking offline attribution?
Go ahead,
Yeah, I think just to start, what I've generally seen work best is working with a partner who's able to track on like an IP address level. And basically like what they're able to do is you send your data to the partner. They're able to see basically, based on this group of people, who's converting, who's not, and then they know who's actually been exposed to the ad. So they're able to almost create their own incremental view of who's actually converting with offline. So I would say that's like the most advanced and sophisticated because these tools are very costly. So I would say that's, for further down the further stage company. In order to kind of validate that data, that's where you'd be running some sort of incrementality test or a geo test kind of within, your offline world. So trying to understand the actual incremental impact of running these different TV spots relative to, places where you're not running anything. So, generally that's what I've seen work. And I think surveys too. I don't trust surveys personally. I don't know if Ryan has different thoughts. But, I think like what we were mentioning earlier, like we can't necessarily trust that people are going to tell us exactly how they heard about us, because I don't think most people knew or know. I don't know personally, like, why did I buy LaCroix today? I don't know. I like LaCroix. How did I hear about it the first time? Like, I have no idea.
Yeah, I think it's easier for smaller businesses that, like the big brand names, even if you're not a customer today, you're not going to be able to answer that question. I think with that, how do you hear about a survey, which is what we're talking about here, is just like, typically it's a post-purchase survey and you're asking that question. It can be pre-purchase, but be careful of that because it can impact conversion. Or maybe it's an email, but it's a trade-off between where you put it and how much signal you get. But there's a few little tricks that I like to do with those that do help some of this. One is I always put in a channel that I'm not actually running, and so that I can get signal on how many people just give me a fake answer. And the other thing is always randomize the answers so that there's not a bias, so that one of them is sitting at the top all the time and just he's getting the straight clicks from people that are just cruising through. And so, that being, I've seen it be what I feel is pretty effective in some businesses. There's others that it hasn't been quite as impactful, but it is one point. And I think it's just adding it into everything else that you're doing. So Ryan, in the direct mail example you gave, I think that how did you hear about a survey? If it's saying like direct mail was really big, that would, maybe have been, fuel for that argument. The other thing I like to do is, instead of saying, how did you, hear about us? I like to ask what most impacted your purchase, because then it's not about first touch, it's about most impactful touch. And I think that's a more valuable signal.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And I guess a final note there is like, just keep in mind, you're not talking to marketers. They're not going to know if they saw it on Facebook organic or, Facebook paid or, whatever. I'd keep it as kind of non-marketer as possible, and just think about like, what do I truly need here to be effective? And I think if you do all of those suggestions, I think it's a reasonable data point.
Yeah, I think you both hit on a good point here, which is sort of the exercise of triangulating around a bunch of data points versus sort of expecting that any one of these strategies in isolation is going to sort of yield the best result. Chelsea, to step back really quickly with some of the like IP address matching vendors you're talking about, can you just call one out by name that's like well known in case anyone wants to dig a little bit deeper into what that sort of a solution looks like?
Yeah, Data Plus Math, who's under LiveRamp. So if you're already on LiveRamp, I think it's somewhat affordable for companies to use, but they're doing something where they basically create a synthetic control group within the audiences and are able to show incremental conversions.
I've worked with some streaming, both TV and audio partners that provide IP matching services directly as well. I do agree with Chelsea. I think especially, I'd say OTT is pretty much there now, and there's a lot of partners that are delivering that. I'd say, streaming audio pretty much is emerging there. So podcasts and things like that, it's becoming better, but that's the way that's going as well. And that's becoming, much more of a digital channel. You have other things though. If you're doing linear TV, typically the way that that's being measured on a time decay spot attribution method. So like how many people came to our site and what is that signal over a period of time. That channel is really big still, even though it's, doesn't have the growth of OTT, but it's still huge. And it doesn't tell you, you might say, hey, we think we got 10 transactions from this, but it doesn't tell you what 10 people. And so it's just a leftover baseline. And so that's a problem when we talk about attribution here, that as your media mix becomes more complex, now you start to have channels that just have a totally different lens that don't fit in with the rest of your digital signals. The other one I would say is direct mail, which is something that I've had be impactful in digital first businesses and also, non-digital businesses, retail businesses, things like that. And you're typically doing a match back to a mail file and you know exactly who converted, but now you need to upload that file somewhere to make sure it's part of your media mix. And that's where it starts to be helpful to have your own your own tools that you've purchased from a third party that you can upload to.
Awesome. Two other sort of general topics that I'm hoping we'll have time to touch on. One, common pitfalls of attribution to watch out for, and then two, some of the like privacy changes, iOS 14.5, et cetera. I see a couple questions that have come in. Please, if you have any, submit those now so that we can just sort of pace appropriately to make sure we can tackle them. But with that, I'll transition the conversation here to pitfalls. I think we've all sort of learned the hard way by doing in our roles on growth marketing teams. But maybe with a quick conversation here, we can identify a few that can help people from having to learn on their own. Chelsea, Ryan, any that come to mind as you're just thinking about like, here are some like, in hindsight, here are some things that I really wish I would have thought about differently or known going into this?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about a few along the way. I would, just to kind of summarize, I think, Chelsea and I agree on this, is like using platform as opposed to attribution, right? So like, don't believe Meta, don't believe, in isolation, take that bigger view. That's one I've seen a lot. And, if you're kind of adding up all your platform data signals and calling that your total, like that's a problem. You can get a lot of double counting from that way. I think particularly doing that with bottom of funnel. So, hey, we had an affiliate transaction, we had a Google brand transaction, and maybe a retargeting display transaction. That might just be like one transaction instead of three, and that person had decided to purchase, and now they're just going around trying to find the best deal. And so really leaning too heavily on those bottom of funnel tactics because of your last touch attribution model can lead to doing some things that can waste money pretty fast. And that is a really big one that I've seen a lot of times.
How about you, Chelsea?
Yeah, I think a common pitfall I've seen is not having enough business context with myself to be questioning the data the way I should be. So, you can look at Google Analytics or look at, whatever tool you're using and assume it's correct. But if you don't necessarily have the business context that like, maybe we launched a new product that day and that's why our conversions are up versus, it's just our channels are much more efficient or something like that. I think that's one thing to be thinking about, because attribution isn't necessarily fully driven by marketing. There's product changes, there's all sorts of changes that can be impacting it too. So that's one pitfall. I would say the other one that I've seen a lot is just assuming that like a new tool can change your world and answer all your questions. Because it's, I think a common saying is bad data in, bad data out. So if you don't have the data that's, there and ready to go to plug into that tool, you're still not going to get the answers that you're looking for.
Yep, good point. In my career, I've had countless vendors try to conflate prospecting data with retargeting data and how they're sort of presenting performance to me. Is there ever a business case for being accepting of that?
I think only in a case where you cannot reach that person on any other channel. So think about like an email unsubscribe. If you can't email that person, you can't send them a push notification, you don't think you can reach them any other way. Like, I think that would be the only exception there, but I don't know. Ryan, do you have any other thoughts?
No, that's dead on. I mean, you should always do it the cheapest way possible, right? So capture that email opt-in, get that app download. I kind of have struggled with, some channels that are out there like direct mail retargeting of site abandons, because I think hopefully not calling anyone out there, but it's, I think you have to use things like that with a light touch, like Chelsea said, where you really know there's value there and you really need to be selective. And so agree on that. I'd say one other thing that I wanted to mention was just, not, we talked about like just in general, like needing to shift to like top of funnel. And I think that's like kind of the biggest thing that I kind of see with these, these pitfalls that people have, is it's just, really underrepresented. So I kind of can't stress that enough, is that, that's usually the place that you need to add more and pull away from bottom of funnel.
Yeah, great. Shift gears a little bit. Ecosystem changes, mostly sort of driven by privacy policy evolution. What have you guys done in your roles or with the companies you're supporting to address attribution challenges that were introduced specifically by iOS 14.5, but also are there any other upcoming privacy policy changes or technical changes that you're aware of and anticipating that you expect to have a material impact on how you'll think about and approach attribution? I know this is a loaded topic. We could spend an hour on it, but can you give me your sort of 1 or 2 minute, like 30,000 foot view?
Yeah, I think generally what we're seeing is this move toward kind of less individual identifiable data. So, companies will no longer know that Chelsea Cramer signed up for our product. They might know that one person signed up for our product using whatever channel, but we won't necessarily have that on an individual level. That's what I think most people are planning for. We have seen the rise of what's being called like a data clean room, which might be run by a media agency, or I think Amazon has their own version as well. But basically the way that would work is you would send all of your user data to this data clean room. They would understand based on their own internal tracking, basically who was exposed, who wasn't, and they'd be able to send back to you basically a total number of people who converted. You wouldn't know who those people were, but you might actually have an idea kind of like holistically how the campaign's doing. And that would, in theory, give you a sense of incrementality instead of just something that's last click. So I'm expecting those to kind of come more into focus a lot more in the next, I would say, like year or so as we continue to lose tracking. I think with iOS specifically, I've seen things with companies setting up like an iOS proxy multiplier, basically. And it might be done based on some sort of testing that you're doing, or just based on an assumption, based on the number of people who are using Apple products, like in relation to your overall funnel. But yeah, it was definitely a challenge when I would say like iOS 14.5 first dropped, and I think everyone was kind of running around with their heads chopped off for a little bit there.
I think we've lost signal, and it's really what's next is still taking shape. One thing that's clearly been gaining a lot of steam is server-side tracking. That is obviously the ad platforms trying to justify themselves. It doesn't necessarily help your attribution, but I do think it really helps keep your marketing being strong, because if you've had campaigns that relied on lookalikes, and now all of a sudden you don't know that someone looks alike anymore, then your campaign's gonna kind of go in a downward spiral. And I think we've seen a lot of that, where it's kind of harder for brands to really show results from Meta. I've seen Meta kind of showing performance losses year over year because of that in their ad spend, and I think that's why it's just companies have not really been able to show that success in the way they have before. I think the server-side tracking can help. I've seen that on other platforms, but the big picture here is we've got signal loss, and we need to replace it with something. The other thing that I wanted to mention was, I'd say early in my career, I kind of would have scoffed at this, but I find myself looking at just kind of like blended overall, what's happening in the business. You really can't hide from total spend versus total transactions, right? Like total new customers, whatever your lens is. If you're attributing something and this is going up, but the total's not going up, that should be a red flag, right? And I've kind of seen that as a problem before, where we think something's moving the needle, but the total is not. So sanity check with blended CAC would be something I would say.
Awesome. Ryan, as an example of server-side tracking, as you're sort of thinking about it, like uploading a flat file of like purchasers into the Facebook platform to sort of identify that conversion event set?
It can be a flat file. I mean, what I'd say would be better would be to either, if you're using Shopify, just implement this like directly through Shopify, or if you have some tech resources, you can, make this a little more customized. But, what I've seen in the past 6 months or so is, at first it was Meta, and, you could do that with Meta and Google. Now, like companies like Pinterest and others are getting involved. And I think it's just kind of into more channels. And I think there's a recognition from ad platforms that they need to justify their kind of existence and spend. And this is one way they do that. The reason I'm advocating it is not because it helps them justify themselves, is because I do think it's a vital feedback loop to actually making sure your marketing, programs grow. You're basically telling them where success happened, where it didn't, and so you can get more of that, and then ultimately have more transactions to attribute. Because if you don't have the transactions, the attribution doesn't matter in the end anyway, right? Because we need to grow the transactions. So that's, I think, the importance of it here. But that has been a major trend.
Perfect. We've only got a few minutes left and a bunch of great questions that have come in. So let's try and sort of go rapid fire through these to be as helpful as we can. One, what online classes do you recommend for GA, if any, that you're familiar with?
I think Google has the best documentation on Google, generally speaking. I know like they offer their own certifications. They have a lot of resources. I think any question I've ever Googled on Google, they're the first result, fair enough. But they generally get you the right answer.
Great. Next question. In the past, I've had a hard time attributing social conversions, especially Facebook, Instagram. Facebook platform gave almost a double number than what I saw in GA, despite using UTM codes and having tracking set up via GTM. What would you lean towards the GA conversion number for reporting? Or I guess, would you lean towards the GA conversion number for reporting?
I'll jump in on that. I would say the GA is going to be clicks. You should look at your Facebook or Meta tracking and see what your attribution settings are in there. I would guess that you probably have a pretty heavy weight to view tracking just from that, and that you might want to have like something like a 7-day click or a 1-day view, as opposed to, it could be, something much more robust, like, or much more generous to Meta, like a longer view transaction. I know they've adjusted the default settings, so depending on, I'm not sure exactly what the default is, but I've been going more towards just optimizing for shorter periods and more definitive signals. In the world we're in, it's really hard to keep track of that person through many sessions and across many devices. And so I've been optimizing my campaigns more for shorter periods, like a 7 or even a 1-day click, and a 1-day view, if a view at all, because I really want those direct clickers. Also, you can look in your GA and see when conversions actually happen on your platform, like how many people convert in the first day of exposure, second day, and get a lens of what kind of, if you've got a lot of your transactions coming in 1 or 2 days, you really probably should set your Facebook, your Meta campaigns to be something similar.
Great. Next question. You step into an early stage AB series company that's having challenges with attribution. What do you look at first? What information and resources would you need? What steps would you take to ensure stakeholders have a good understanding on changes?
I can jump in on that. So one thing that I have found in just really early stage businesses, a lot of times there's this kind of mentality of, you've got a lot of people just moving fast and not everybody knows what everything's doing. And so first thing I usually try to do is pull together all the signals. Like, it's even sometimes as simple as like, we don't even know what we're spending and where, and just like really capturing all of that. Like, what is all the investment that's happening? Where is it happening? What is that, that kind of total number of transactions? And let's just level set that. What's that curve doing of spend and transactions in CAC? And then let's start to try to pull it apart into some of those other layers of attribution. But a lot of times, those very basic questions, aren't being answered. And maybe even more importantly, like, what does that curve look like compared to what our actual LTV is? Like, are we doing things that are positive for the business or not? You can answer a lot of really important things without attributing a single transaction. And that's where I would start. And then I would start to peel back and say, all right, well, yeah, is Meta adding to this favorably or not? Is Google adding to it favorably or not? But at that top level, I think that's where you start.
Awesome. I'll jump ahead to the next question here. How might you approach attribution with different sales channels? And a couple are listed: retail environment, online, in-app. Maybe for the sake of efficiency, do either of you have experience with retail sales and any sort of insights or best practices that you can speak to?
I have some. It's been a while, and the world has changed. It's always been kind of a blended model, but my experience is a little too dated there to maybe even comment.
Yeah, I was going to say likewise. I've definitely seen the way some companies do it are based on, putting your email address in at checkout so that they're able to like tie you back to any transactions you've taken based on like, the cookie ID that they have internally. But yeah, I think that's a really, really rough answer there.
I know, and just would advise being careful on that. I know there was a big wave of that a while back, and I think at least here in California, I think we maybe have laws against that. And one other thing, like everything we're talking about is so regional as well. Like if someone's, here in California have higher privacy standards than a lot of the rest of the US, Europe is a whole nother thing. And so I think this all needs to have a local lens to it as well. But certainly that's, would be an ideal signal if you're able to do it.
Great. We'll end on an aspirational note here. What is the best attribution model you've ever seen? What channels did it cover and types of insights did it produce? Not sure how to answer this concisely, but I'll leave that to you too.
Yeah, the best model I've ever seen was a client that had basically made an assumption about the incremental impact of every channel they were working with, from basically all the main digital channels as well as offline. From there, they build out spend curves so that they could understand basically their marginal CPAs, which means basically what's the most expensive conversion you'll get on each of these channels. And from there, that's how they decided to allocate spend to try and get every single channel to basically whatever their assigned marginal CPA was, so that they knew if, finance shows up like, hey, you've got an extra $1 million to spend, they knew exactly where to put it, where it would be most efficient. That was like a public company very far along in their journey. I wouldn't expect most companies to get there, but I think that's like the dream state for companies.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I'd say my most advanced was a company spending several $100 million a year on marketing. It had gotten to a similar place. Really, what you want to do is, that incremental dollar, where should I spend it, right? And you've got a diminishing curve of return, and you shouldn't be looking at that kind of, like the average of that attribution curve. It's really just that, incremental million or incremental 100K, where is that going to be best? And that's, I think, the, what you can do when you get to a place like Chelsea described.
Great. Well, we're at time. Thank you both so much. I found this very insightful and hope others did as well. If anyone could use help with these kinds of things through folks like Rian and Chelsea through Right Side Up, or any other areas where you can sort of come in a consulting capacity, please reach out. As noted before, we'll share a copy of this recording and the slides. There weren't many slides, but we'll share all of that by email. So if you want to come back to it at a later point, you'll have that with you. Thank you all for spending the time with us, and hope we'll be able to continue the conversation with some of you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.